Welcome to State of Tech, Synechron's innovation podcast. Synechron is a leading global digital transformation consulting firm focused on financial services and big technology organizations. Our State of Tech podcast hosts subject matter experts and business leaders as they explore emerging technologies, industry insights, innovation trends, and more. Let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome to the latest edition of Synechron's State of Tech podcast series. I'm Tim Jennings, the head of our data practice, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Ryan Cox, co-head of our AI practice. Ryan and I have recently been discussing the European AI Act. So maybe, Ryan, if you could kick things off by just exploring the implications and consequences of that act.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. Happy to. So I think, a lot of things have happened recently in the regulatory space. And I think really the EU has been one of the first ones to build this comprehensive framework on AI worldwide. So it's an interesting start and really an interesting topic to me to see where we are today. And as this sort of regulatory framework builds out, where we're going to go for ourselves and for our clients. So I think really the premise here is to ensure AI systems respect that fundamental rights, safety, ethical principles, all the good stuff that really makes sense from a common sense standpoint, putting it down on paper so that there's some guidelines and some areas that we can follow. I think one of the key areas, and it's probably actually worth defining what artificial intelligence means, and then we can discuss a little bit more about some of the risk-based approach that the EU Act takes. So I think first and foremost, artificial intelligence systems, by definition for the Act, really means a machine-based system that's designed to operate with some varying level of autonomy, and it may exhibit adaptiveness after its deployment towards some certain objectives that it may have. So it'll take some input in that it receives. Based on that, it infers some outputs like predictions, recommendations, decisions, and that can really influence the physical or virtual environment.
Do you think that will also apply retrospectively? Because those systems are not necessarily new, are they?
From a retrospective perspective, yeah, I think it will encompass AI systems as a whole, but certainly where fines and compliance come into place, there's going to be probably, for most systems, a 2 or 3 year period between when the act becomes in force, which is expected in sort of May or June this year, until it becomes something that companies need to look at and could actually get fined for and need to make sure that they have all their systems in place.
When you look at some of the other regulation around the globe, it's quite general, it's well-intentioned, but non-specific. Do we see the European Act getting more specific and actually giving better, more concrete guidance?
Absolutely. And I think we saw this with other regulations like GDPR. I mean, it starts out with a high-level framework, but then you still have all the technical articles and all the responses and things that will be coming in, and that can be easily a year plus. So I think we'll see a lot of change in this space, and I think the AI offices are going to be very, very busy from that standpoint, organizing themselves, responding to this, and expanding on this framework.
And can you explore for us just in more detail what this fundamental underpinning framework is? What does that assessment actually mean? How are people assessing the applications, and what does it mean to fall into one of those categories?
Fundamentally, it's a risk-based top-down approach, and it also adds a new European AI board to oversee the implementation. To focus a little bit on the risk-based piece, because I think that's really where the meat of all this is, it breaks it down into different risk levels. So the Act allows for free use of what they call minimal risk AI. So that's applications like AI-enabled video games or spam filters, things that are really a vast majority of where AI systems play in the EU. So that's a very minimal risk category. Then you kind of move up the curve a little bit and you get into more high-risk systems. So they're permitted, but they're subject to a lot more compliance within the requirements. Conformity assessments before the market release has to happen. So a lot more scrutiny needs to be involved in terms of documentations in your systems. And just to give a couple examples, that may be areas such as recruitment or biometric identification and surveillance systems. So there's definitely a higher bar that companies need to go through as providers and deployers of these systems. And then there's the final category, which is a bit more on the prohibited side. That's where the EU AI Act thinks maybe these systems are unacceptable because they pose some sort of safety, security risk. Maybe they alienate some fundamental rights that we look at. And I think there's some interesting topics and potentially areas in places like China are looking at things like social scoring. So that's an area I think the EU is looking at and saying we are not prepared to go deep into that space. Things like emotional recognition in the workplace, predictive policing of individuals, so kind of like a Minority Report, if you've seen the movie. I think those are the areas where the EU is basically saying those are a no-go.
Those are off limits.
Yeah.
And so obviously most of our clients are in financial services. We've been building AI solutions for those clients for 10 years or so. Where do you think the bulk of the AI use within our client base is likely to fall on that category from minor to prohibitive?
I think a majority, at least today, of what we're seeing when we're talking to our clients are going to be in that minimal risk system, because these are kind of looking at things that are a little bit more safe. And as particularly the big banks are looking at these systems, they don't want to make the front page of the news for anything controversial. So I think step one is very much human in the loop, show that there's operational efficiencies, productivity gains. And I think that's where we start today. Now, as you move the timeline forward, maybe over the next year, 2 years, I think we will see a lot more cases that might be considered higher risk. So if you look at things like maybe a high net worth individual might be going to a tier 1 bank and saying, I'd like some financial advice. And those kind of systems that are giving advice, that are answering questions that are maybe a little bit more sensitive in nature, those could actually be considered high risk, particularly if decisions are made. So let's say that I'm trying to get a mortgage and maybe there's a decision made about my credit worthiness. Those are kind of the systems that I could see maybe in a year's time as we mature a bit. But I think for today, we'll stick to the minimal risk until we get a few more things into production.
That makes sense. I would also, thinking around the potential use cases, areas like HR, I feel like a potential risk. So there's obvious gains to be made there. You can see how particularly generative AI gives you a bias-free way of matching CVs with jobs and that kind of use case. But you could also imagine how that scenario is going to quickly lead you into areas where the European AI Act is going to be you're in higher risk.
We mustn't forget that there's a number of regulations in play. So these don't stand on their own. There's a lot of intersection between these. But interestingly, the EU AI Act does have a couple provisions. So you can be a high risk system. So let's say, one of the HR systems, but there's a couple exceptions that they look at where you can say, well, the AI system is intended to improve the result of a previously completed human activity. So I think if you can show and argue that the AI systems in place are actually less biased, as you mentioned, than sort of the human counterparts, there are a couple exceptions there, but I think we need to tread very carefully. If they're using systems to screen candidates or to look at employee assessments, those are definitely high risk, and we have to be a bit careful. And we have to also understand the data that's underpinning and is training these AI systems. How do you get that governance right? How do you ensure that your AI systems are looking at data that's not biased?
I mean, the AI Act calls out fairly boldly a couple of things you're going to have to do from within inside the organization if you're going particularly in the high-risk category of AI solutions. The first one, as you say, is data governance. Now, again, for financial services firms, they're already doing data governance as part of the financial model risk management process. If you're doing risk reporting, you're already doing AI governance around that. But if you're now pushing that into new areas, if, for example, you're going to go into HR and you're using trained models in HR, but you're using your data, you have to be able to evidence where that's coming from. So this may extend the use of that governance. You also need to be able to reproduce that evidence. For example, you find yourself, heaven forbid, in court or you're contravening the act and exposed in that way. You will need to evidence the data that you used to train the model. So it's essential that not only have you kept the data, but you've also tracked which data was involved in the training at that time when the event occurred. So that's a higher bar from a data governance perspective. And that's likely to force a reassessment of the way that data governance is being done in some of these organizations, certainly in terms of scope, potentially in terms of that temporal element. So it's the data at the time, and in terms of repeatability. So that's going to be an interesting area. I think the other thing that we see, again, spelled out in the app is that you need to do some level of AI governance, which many organizations don't do today. So we know that some do. Some organizations have existing processes to pre-assess an application to work out which category, not using the European AI categories, but using their own independently arrived at categories, which category they think a solution falls into. For them, actually, I think the AI Act is going to be useful because it gives them a regulatory framework they can actually fall back on now rather than their own internal one. So that's going to help in terms of having a recognized standard.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think that's why there's always going to be that close partnership between what we're doing in data, what we're doing in AI, what we're doing in cloud. If you overlay all of the regulations that are coming in globally, not just at AI, but historically, what are we doing with these data and how are we servicing our clients? I think there is a lot of how do we regulate this and how do you set up the governance internally within our companies to set things right so that it becomes a lot easier. And then you could almost have this central organization be responsible within a company to collect the information and make sure people are following it. But I think ultimately what we want to do is democratize AI just as we've done with data so that we can federate that out to the various groups so that you don't get the shadow IT version of AI.
I think that's a brilliant point, and that we absolutely see that happening today with some of our clients. So a common pattern with the Gen AI adoption is that companies will crowdsource within themselves different use cases. They'll triage them to work out which have the best value. And then they'll use an innovation team or an AI team to try and implement that as a proof of concept or proof of value. What that does, unfortunately, is it leaves all the use cases that were not selected on a backlog, which is then not being serviced. And so inevitably what you see is that the people who came up with those ideas, who feel that will be transformative for their corner of the world, will look to go and build their own solutions. And actually, I think for AI to really have the transformative power that we believe in, we want to have a single funnel through which all AI apps come within a firm. We want to federate it. We want to democratize it. We want people to be able to do that. And to enable that, you absolutely need governance. I think for me, that governance is not a hurdle, it's an enabler. It means that you can trust anyone in your firm then, as long as they're working within the governance framework you've set up. You can trust them to go ahead and build those applications and to be confident.
And then I guess you probably have a few lessons for our listeners here from a data side of things that you've seen and been building out over the last few years.
When I look at how we roll out the AI governance, for me, it has to be very practical, and it impacts the SDLC. So what we've been talking about is how do you instrument the SDLC and make sure that at every point you're asking the correct question for AI. For instance, at the very beginning, you need to ask, should we be building this application at all? Where does this fit into the EU category? Where does it fit against ethical boundaries? Where does it fit against use of data boundaries? Are we going to be able to successfully implement this without causing harm? Question one. Most organizations don't have that built into their SDLC today. And that then goes all the way through every stage of the SDLC. Needs to be cognizant of the AI responsibilities that are being assigned by this act and the ethical responsibilities, of course, that go with that.
I think companies are getting really excited to build these proof of concepts. We really just need to have a little bit of a checklist as we're collecting these use cases to say, can we do it? Should we do it? What are some things that we need to think about ethically, to your point?
It needs to be evidenced. You need to record that to be able to evidence to a regulator to your AI governance process so that you can explain how that's all happened. There are also some interesting nuances in terms of where responsibility lies. If, for example, you were to take a large language model, commercially available large language model, and either do fine tuning on that or build a RAG system on that, in terms of the AI Act, in terms of the accountability for that, how's that going to work? Do you become the producer? Do you become the provider?
That's another really good topic. I'm glad you brought it up. So in addition to the risk assessment, there's actually one other big piece that the EU AI Act talks about, and that's GPAI systems. That's a general purpose AI system. So when you think about things like ChatGPT, OpenAI, those are very general, highly versatile systems that are capable to give information across various domains. Because they're so general purposed and because they're so powerful, the Act really calls that out and distinguishes them and has additional obligations, particularly ones that are posing systemic risk. You need to really understand the nuances of what those models are doing and how do you contain those models. So there becomes that concept of an AI system provider and an AI system deployer. So when you look at these general purpose ones, there are some other obligations that the providers of these systems need to do. So things like Microsoft behind OpenAI will need to have a set of documentation about what's their training data, how they've come to get to where they are today with those models. It's really important that those systems have well documented, as well as then the deployers of those systems. So let's say if you're a bank, you leverage OpenAI in your systems. Well, you have to make sure that you have the documentation in place from OpenAI in this case. And you also need to make sure that as a deployer that you're following and you understand based on your risk category, what you need to do, what you need to document and what you're applying to. So the EU Act does specify that to a degree.
Particularly in financial services, which is already a regulated industry. Some of the frameworks for these exist in a baseline level. My suspicion is there are two frameworks that firms will reach for when it comes to trying to control these things. The first one would be the model management framework that already exists for financial modeling. It's not, as specified, adequate to control AI. You would need to take that process and enhance it to make all your AI models. That would be one natural way in which particularly regulated financial services might look. Another would be ML ops. So if a firm is already using AI and it's got a functioning, sophisticated ML ops solution, they might take that and say, okay, well, let's enhance this to add in the additional step that the EU AI Act has brought in. Does this feel like common ways in which we would expect firms to try and approach that?
Yeah, I think those are fantastic starting points. And as you said, there's a lot of work already in place and these companies are already using them. There's a few nuances. And I think as an industry, we're going to be building these up and thinking through it. But the sheer fact that these AI systems are non-deterministic adds a set of challenges, right? A lot of the model-based frameworks that banks are using have very deterministic systems. They have a set of numbers your model could accept from 0 to 100, and it outputs another number from 0 to 100, and it's fairly easy to keep track of. From an AI perspective, your set of inputs is multimodal. Your set of outputs is non-deterministic. You can even run the same question to the chatbot 20 different times, and you're going to get 20 different answers. They may all be similar depending on how you adjust some of the parameters as you call into these models. But there needs to be different ways of quantitatively showing how your models are behaving. And not just at the time of deployment, but how your models are going to behave over time as you upgrade the model, as your data sets change. So there's a lot of complexity that needs to happen, particularly for these general purpose AI models that really needs to be taken into account. So great starting points on what we have. I think we're just going to see a lot of work and effort being spent looking at ways to quantify these models. There are a few like Blue and Rouge and ways to score how well these models are doing. So we'll need to see how that replicates at scale, how we can document that and capture that throughout the SDLC.
Do you think if you're going to use those sorts of standards, Rouge and so on, can you talk a little bit about how easy it is to retrofit that to a model that's already there, or whether it's better to embrace that up front and build the baseline for your model?
I think you can retrofit it to a degree. And again, it also depends what your model is doing. Like Blue and Rouge are very specific for certain types of models. They won't fit all general purpose AI models. So horses for courses, I think there will be some degree of retrofitting, but given that we have 24 to 36 months to work on what these rules are highlighting and putting into place, firms will come up with better approaches. So I think we're going to actually see a lot of innovation, which to me is actually exciting. Collectively, the industry knows that they have to get better because general purpose AI and this approach towards AI models and using them in production has a little bit of a make or break scenario. So we talked about a company making front page news. Nobody wants to do that. They don't want that reputational hit and damage trust, but it could go further than that. If it's big enough, it's not just going to impact that one company. It could impact all the companies. It could impact the use of how AI is taken into account across the industry and globally. So given that the stakes are that high, the industry has good incentive to work together, which should be a great breeding ground for innovation.
If you were to summarize the key points, what do you think the takeaways are for firms looking to govern, control, and benefit from AI?
I think like anything else, just prioritize that transparency that you have and capture that at the onset. It's a lot harder to retrofit everything from model validation frameworks to good data governance. Doing that after the fact is much, much harder than doing it at the time. So as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, doing that earlier is going to be really important. Adopting that risk-based approach, conducting those assessments and assuring quality and understanding what your training data is also going to be key. And really just understanding the gravity of this. I mean, non-compliance could be reputational damage for your firm. And as we said, for the industry at large, understanding that impact and taking it seriously, those are all best practices.
The upside, of course, is if you do all these things properly, then you can federate, you can democratize, you can embrace the use of AI across your firm, and that is transformative.
Thank you, Tim. It's been an honor chatting about this topic with you and look forward to doing it again sometime.
Thanks for listening to the Synechron State of Tech podcast. Don't forget to like and share this episode and subscribe to stay up to date on all of the latest and innovative technologies savvy businesses need to know about. To learn more about Synechron, head to our website at www.synechron.com. Stay tuned.